Bill, it's an honor to get to be here with you. I feel like I'm standing in the presence of greatness right now, looking at these artifacts. Also getting to stand next to you, one of the greatest historians of all time in the museum.
Well, hardly. Thank you very much, though, Tyler. That's very kind of you.
Tell us the honor of what we have to be standing in front of.
Well, most people think of the Naval Aviation Museum, they think of aircraft, and obviously that's makes sense because they're the biggest artifacts we have. But this human stories behind each of those aircraft is really what makes naval aviation history. And what we have here are a collection of some of our most notable artifacts that belong to various individuals from all eras of naval aviation. And what we use these for is we've, since 2016, have taught a class to all flight students that come through here. So every Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard flight student will come through and have a history tour of the museum. And so they'll get a sense of what they're becoming a part of. And
this is front seat and back seat.
Right, that's correct. And it gives them a sense of what they're about ready to become a part of. And we tour them around, show them the airplanes. But then we bring them in here, and the capstone is to show them these artifacts related to the individuals that perform really incredible things. And what we tell them is there have been approximately 180,000 naval aviators designated since 1911. And obviously that figure changes by the week. But we profile the fact that, no matter what those aviators did, they may have been one tour. They may have served in a time of peace and didn't have to fly in combat. Then you have some that did extraordinary things in combat, but each one of them has a story, just like they are going to eventually have a story in their own careers. And then we highlight the stories of some of the 180,000 by telling them about these artifacts. So it's a really, it's a cool thing they get to experience. The general public doesn't get a chance to see all of these. And
so this is special that we
It's very special that you get to see it. Some of them have been on display, but a lot of them don't see.
And what we're looking here is, these are not replicas?
These are not replicas. Everything is actual that you see here. Nothing
that's
replica.
Special. Man, take it away. I'm excited to see what you have to show us.
Okay. Well, one benefit of the fact that naval aviation has been involved in the space program for so many years is the fact that we would be able to contact astronauts and say, hey, can you take something into orbit for us? And so they would routinely accommodate. So we have a lot of things in the collection, or I would say a handful of things that have actually orbited the Earth many times. And this is one of those things. So that's what makes these naval aviator wings very special, because they've been into outer space. But what makes them most special is they belong to Barbara Allen Rainey, the first female naval aviator. And this year, 2023, is 50 years since the first women reported for flight training. So those are her wings of gold. And then contrasting with those wings as far as their age, they were awarded in the 1970s. These are some of the earliest wings of gold we have, and they belong to Godfrey de Chevalier, who was Naval Aviator number 7. And he is notable because he is the first naval aviator to ever make a carrier arrested landing. Did so on board USS. Those are his actual wings. No, no problem at all. And they probably have a little more real gold in them than they do now, because they actually contracted with a jeweler, Bailey Banks and Biddle, back in those days. Wow. And so those were his wings of gold.
Considerable difference. I see the bombs are not there. The bomblets that are.
Oh, right. Yep. Exactly. Yeah, they've been modified over the years.
Wow.
And he made that landing in October 1922, and then he was killed in a crash, actually, just a few weeks after that happened. And then we have some interesting things tied to World War II. This is a section of life raft, and this is one of the coolest things we've ever gotten. It belonged to a retired Rear Admiral who started off his naval career as a submariner and then became an aviator. And he lived in the Norfolk area. And the former director of the museum, Captain Bob Rasmussen, was up visiting his son, who's also a retired Captain Eric Rasmussen. And this guy, his family, lived down the street. And they said, hey, we have this thing that we think you'd like at the museum. And what it is, it's a section of life raft that their grandfather or their father had cut out from the raft of an individual who'd been rescued. September 1944, USS Finback, and the second name you see down is Lieutenant Junior Grade George H.W. Bush. So that's President Bush's signature on either the day of or the day after he was rescued.
Oh man, I bet you not a lot of people know that.
No.
And you actually have a piece of an
Yes.
actual product.
Yes,
Oh
so
my
it
gosh.
wasn't his life raft. There's somebody, it's cool, somebody is noted on here as whose raft this belonged to. But very
Wow.
farsighted, obviously had no idea that young
Mm-hmm.
Lieutenant Junior Gray was going to be the future President of the United
Yep.
States, but a very momentous artifact.
Wow.
And this is a logbook. Aviator logbooks are like flying diaries. They document an aviator's flights throughout his career, and that belongs to Marion Carl, who was the first Marine fighter ace of World War II,
Wow.
received 2 Navy Crosses. And the page I have it open to is August of 1942, and it covers some of his combat time at Guadalcanal. And you can just see the intense combat action. He was
Yep.
shot down himself. He shot down Japanese aircraft. But what's really unique about it is you'll notice there are initials JTS that are next to some of his write-ups, which are certifying that what he is writing is accurate. And JTS was his squadron commander, Major John Smith, who was a Medal of Honor recipient. So you have the first Marine fighter ace and
an
the
MOH.
initials of an MOH there. So that is a pretty cool artifact.
Wow.
And the Doolittle raid is, a lot of people will come into the museum and they'll say, why do you have a B-25 in here? And of course the Doolittle raiders and launching the B-25s from USS Hornet. Well, they needed to have somebody train them in how to take off from a short distance. So what I'd like to tell the flight students and tours when they come in, when that happened, you had to have a special relationship because Jimmy Doolittle at the time was one of the most acclaimed pilots in the world. He had a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT. He had patents to his credit. He'd done work in blind flying, instrument flying. He's a champion air racing pilot. There's very little he didn't know how to do in an airplane, but he didn't know how to take off in a short distance. So the Navy grabbed a flight instructor, called him in, said, hey, go down to Eglin Field, now Eglin Air Force Base. You'll find out what you're going to do when you get there. So Lieutenant Henry Miller heads down there, and there he is face to face with Jimmy Doolittle. So what I like to tell people is, imagine for that process, that operation to have worked, Jimmy Doolittle had to have humility. He had to be able to look at this young lieutenant and not be somebody that said, you know, I know everything. He's inexperienced. I'm more experienced. He had to be willing to be taught, in essence. And that flight instructor had to have the confidence to be able to tell somebody he probably looked up to growing up, you're not doing that correctly. And so it was that relationship, the fact that they got off on that footing helped to make that operation successful. But Lieutenant Miller became Rear Admiral Miller, and before he died, we have pictures in our museum archives, he's visiting, and he dropped off some of the stuff he had assembled from his time training the Doolittle Raiders. So there's some handwritten notes there where he's charting how the Raiders are doing. There's a signed letter from Jimmy Doolittle thanking him and expressing his appreciation. And then there are a copy of his orders.
First lieutenant.
Right. Not quite sure the Navy rank structure back then. But those are his orders. He got $6 a per diem back then. And the orders were issued by A.C. Reed, who was the commander of the NC-4 flying boat, first aircraft to fly across the Atlantic, which we have here in the museum.
Wow.
And on a personal note, A.C. Reed is the captain. He was the CO of the base who presented my grandfather his wings of gold when he got them here in 1941.
That's special.
Yeah, and I later went on to find out that Lieutenant Miller, when he became Rear Admiral, he was the one who called John McCain's family, his dad and his mom, to let him know that he'd been shot down over Vietnam. So there's all sorts of connections in naval aviation.
You never know.
You never know.
Just never know.
Yes, and these dog tags here are real special and interesting because of how we got them and the story they tell. We get all sorts of things from a variety of different sources. Things will arrive in the mail unannounced. People will bring in families mementos, and this gentleman brought in a sea chest, and the sea chest was from his dad, who was a lieutenant commander. His name was Robert Price, and he had been a naval aviator in World War II. And this captain, retired Civil Engineer Corps captain, brought in this sea chest about his father. And his father had just a very fascinating story. He went to the University of Illinois, got his wings before World War II, and flew off the USS Lexington. And then he was actually overseas in the Far East helping the British as an exchange pilot when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So he experienced some of the early days of the war in the Far East, in Hong Kong, Singapore, I can't remember one of the two. And so he was under fire there. comes back, eventually becomes an F-6F Hellcat pilot, and he's flying off the USS Cowpens, which is a light carrier in World War II, in June of 1944. He's making a strafing run, is hit by enemy fire, shot down, has to make a water landing. And when he's trying to get out of his airplane, his life raft is caught up on something. So he's not able to fully get it out. So he's floating around in the water essentially with his Mae West life vest on is all he has. Well, as he's floating in the water, he notices his empty fuel tank, his auxiliary fuel tank, as the airplane sank, it detached, floated to the surface, and it was about 75 yards away from him. So he swims over that distance, and he's just going to hang on to the tank and to give him some extra flotation. And so that's what his intention is. And then he notices a silhouette of a ship on the horizon, and he notices or remembers from his recognition training, hey, that's not a U.S. silhouette. It's a Japanese destroyer. Comes very close to him, so close that he can see the sailors on the deck, but he uses that fuel tank to just duck low, hides under it, and they avoid seeing him. But he still has a problem. He's floating around. And one of his squadron mates comes and drops his own life raft to him, and inside that life raft is a can of drinking water and a note that says, I'll be back tomorrow with a float plane to come and get you. And Price was the squadron commander, so this pilot also noted what had happened to some on that particular mission. So he spends the night in the raft. Next day, sure enough, they fly over, but picking up that little raft in the Pacific, they missed him. So now he's floating around and he doesn't have a note that says somebody's going to come get me. So he spends the next 11 days in that life raft, and he's trying to figure out, okay, how do I stay alive? So he covers his body as much as possible to keep his the skin from being exposed. He kills a seagull, writes later that you don't want to eat a seagull because they make you thirstier and they taste terrible. And then he catches 2 fish that literally jump into his raft because he has sharks circling the whole time. And but water's his big problem. And there's the device on the life raft that can catch fresh water as it goes over. But into those 11 days, he did not have one rain shower pass over him. So he allotted himself 1 sip out of that can every night, which is incredible that he survived on that. And then luckily he was rescued by a destroyer that found him. He lost 28 pounds during the course of 11 days in the life raft. And then he comes home, sees his family, and then he goes out back to the USS Cowpens, and he's the air officer now, not a squadron commander. And they're going through a typhoon, and a Hellcat breaks loose on the deck, slams into another one, a fire starts on the deck, and he heads down onto the flight deck and he's helping out with that situation, and he's washed overboard. So I wrote an article once about him, the sea gave him up once, it didn't give him up again. He was missing in action, never seen again. And so his son kept all of, and his mom and then passed on to the son, this sea chest with all of his stuff in it. And what was interesting is toward the bottom of it, in between 2 pieces of glass, was the note that his squadron mate had dropped him. So we still have that note. But also in there were his dog tags, and that's why they're rusted. They were around his neck for those 11 days.
The time frame of when he spent 11 days in
June of 1944.
To then?
It was still in that month of June.
So he went back in the ocean within 30 days.
Oh, actually, he was rescued in June, and then it was actually December 1944 when he went back out to USS Cowpens. So, pretty harrowing story.
That is unbelievable.
Sent on
and
there.
Did they stamp them back then?
They did. They're just so rusted that you just really can't see them.
Wow.
And there's his flare gun firing pin on there too, which was to no avail.
Crazy. Crazy. All right.
And these are some of our more post-World War II items. One of the more real popular ones that people like to see is Neil Armstrong's flight training record. The Navy creates something for every aviation student, aviators, aircrew. I'm sure you have one. Aviation training jacket, or ATJ. And what it is just your record of flight school. And the Navy generally keeps them for 50 years because primarily, say something in your career, you have a mishap or something, they are able to go back to your flight record and see if you had any tendencies in flight school. So it's part of the safety process. But we get first right of refusal as the Navy's Aviation Museum. And so we can request famous ones to come here for in perpetuity, because the National Archives, who actually stores these for the Navy, they are mandated by law to destroy them after 50 years. So imagine if some of these just went into the shredder.
Yep.
So this is Neil Armstrong's as a flight student. Pink sheets are something you don't want to get in flight school. I think there's about 3 of them in there for various deficiencies.
Wait. So he wasn't just a superstar?
No. And pretty much no aviator's record we have here was a superstar. And not all instructors were correct, because there's one we have here. His name was Lieutenant William Hall, and an instructor just wrote, he has no self-confidence in the air. Later on at the Battle of Coral Sea, he shot down 3 Japanese aircraft and received the Medal of Honor. So obviously, he developed some confidence since flight school. But what we'd like to point out to the flight students is that, naval aviation is a constant pursuit of perfection, but you never fly the perfect flight. And you know that from your time at the Blue Angels. The Blue Angels are famous for self-evaluation, saying, I can do better on this. And you say, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But that's the culture of naval aviation, trying to get better with every flight. And we point out that Neil Armstrong had below averages routinely on various things. And there's not one page in there where the instructor said, hey, you need to get better at this. And so it's a good lesson for them to see somebody who became one of the most acclaimed aviators in history.
Bet you this resonates with students more than anything.
It does. It's I notice, I watch them take pictures of things afterwards, because they're welcome to take pictures. And the 2 things they take pictures of the most are Neil Armstrong and the Medal of Honor. So those are the ones that really resonate with me.
I know for a fact that, I was just talking with some of the guys earlier today about it's humbling when you have an instructor that says, you suck today.
Right.
It may not affect you immediately,
right? But
then you go home, you sit down, and you think about it, and you're like, what do they mean by that? Right. And then it's just a little bit of a fire for you to go back the next day and I'm going to try and do better. I may not meet your bar, but I'm going to try and beat my bar.
Right.
And it's internal, and you build upon, and as you can see with Exhibit A,
exactly. I mean,
doesn't matter where you go.
Absolutely.
You can make something of it. And that's a beautiful artifact.
Yeah.
I can't believe we're looking
there's a
at
little
that.
write up here where another thing, an instructor said he has the makings of an average pilot. So obviously, Neil Armstrong superseded that. And then we have some these items relate to the Vietnam War. The squadron duty officer log just came to us from somebody in the squadron who had saved it, and it belonged to an attack squadron, A6 squadron. It was their squadron duty officer logbook. And I tell the students that, if you're all going to be the SDO one day, and it's generally a boring job, you sit there with your logbook and you chart the comings and goings. But Lieutenant Ron Zlotoper showed up in the ready room on board the Forstall one July day in 1967, and all hell broke loose. A fire on the flight deck, over 130 sailors killed during the course of fighting that fire. But you can look at his write-up there, and despite the fact that he's having to abandon one ready room to go another because of smoke going into one, despite the fact that he doesn't know where Lieutenant so-and-so is and Airman Smith is missing, he just carried forth with his duty. He did what he had to do and what he always did. And there's very few cross-outs. The writing is neat. So it just it teaches them to focus on the task at hand, because you're always going to have stuff bombarding you, trying to compete for your attention, but you have to focus on what matters at that moment. And that's a great example of that.
Having been an SDO for quite a few years, that was my first thought when I looked at that. As I said, that handwriting A is perfect. Like, is this legit? Is this real?
Right.
And you're like, yeah, it's absolutely real.
Yeah.
And my favorite thing to do when I would take over the SDO watch in my squadron is I would look at the handwriting previously and see who cared and who didn't care.
Right.
Because you're like, yeah, I'm here. And then you see something like this, like as you said, all hell's breaking loose, and they're still cataloging exactly as the book says to do, which you never know. Now it's an artifact of something that is an extremely famous incident in our history, and to look at the actual artifact to know that that book right there was actually on the Forstall when all hell was breaking loose, and it survived.
Yes, it's amazing, and it's just a very personal story of that event. It's not a recollection from years past. It was moment by moment what was experiencing.
What would be interesting to see is to go back and read that book and see the day-to-day operations, and then all of a sudden see now all hell broke loose right here. And you can almost relive the event just by what's being cataloged in that journal.
Right, and it's such a well-known event that the pictures, you can get a sense of what was going on on the flight deck above, and it really puts it into perspective. It's
Having been on a ship when some things have gone wrong, I know that the fog of war can really affect the daily operation, which is, to me, it blows me away to be able to see this right here, because I know when we lose power, we lose steering, or something goes wrong, or a jet crashes or anything, it's just confusion.
Right,
It's total
and
confusion.
there's nowhere to go.
Yep.
I mean, you're surrounded by ocean. There's no, okay, I'll just
Go to the front,
yeah,
go to the back.
That's
right.
About it. Exactly. So, but yeah, real storied event in naval aviation history, and just a great artifact about it. And this is another thing that we just get a tremendous amount of interest. It's one of the medals of honor we have, and it belonged to a helicopter pilot named Clyde Lassen, who he and his crew were on board a guided missile destroyer in June of 1968. And there was an F-4 Phantom that was flying a combat mission over North Vietnam. It was a moonless night, so Lieutenant Commander John Holtzclaw was the pilot, Lieutenant Commander Zeke Burns was the Rio, and they had surface-to-air missiles come up at them. And so they dodged 2 SAMs, but the third one got them. And the pilot, Holtzclaw, recalled later, he said, the minute I saw that third SAM, I knew my flying that night was over. I couldn't get out of the way.
Yeah.
So they punch out, and luckily it was a moonless night, so they could actually hear the voices of the North Vietnamese trying to find them, but they were successfully able to hide. And they made their way up a ridge line. Halfway up a ridge line, it was heavily wooded, and at the bottom of the ridge was a rice paddy and a clearing. And so they called in for rescue. So Lieutenant Clyde Lassen, Lieutenant Junior Grade Leroy Cook, his co-pilot, and then aviation machinists mates Bruce Dallas and Don West, they were on their helicopter, a UH-2 Sea Sprite, and within 10 minutes, off they went. So here they are, they're a really slow helicopter, no night vision goggles back then, they're operating by parachute flares, and they make their way into Vietnam, have a surface-to-air missile fired at them that passes underneath. So they get in position over the 2 guys, and as they're putting the rescue hoist down, the parachute flares went out. So Lieutenant Lassen was totally disoriented. The helicopter hits a tree, and hits with such force that a cabin door is almost completely knocked off the helo. It later fell off during the course of the mission. So he manages somehow to keep the helicopter in the air. They clear the area, and then they take an assessment as a crew. It was not just him making the decision. He talked to the co-pilot, the machinist mates in the back, and they said, let's evaluate our aircraft here. And it was rattling, as you could imagine, but it was still airworthy, and they felt that they could stay in the fight and get these 2 guys out.
Wow.
So, but Lassen knew he couldn't go back to where he was before, so he yelled at them to make their way down to the hill, bottom of the hill. And we have actually his radio calls in our museum archives. So you can hear him over the helicopter. You've got to get down the hill. You've got to get down the hill. So they're making their way down, and he's running out of fuel. And eventually he has fuel for one more attempt. So he tells them he's coming in. By that time, they're at the edge of the rice paddy in the clearing, and they start racing across. And Lassen descends, and he doesn't actually touch down. He hovers over so it doesn't get stuck. So you can imagine what rotor wash does around a rice paddy, mud, water.
Yep.
And then the parachute flares decide to go out again. And that's where Lassen made a very courageous decision. He turned the landing lights on his helicopter. And so he's a target now for every enemy gun in the vicinity, but the 2 guys can see him. So they race across. One of the air crewmen gets out onto the ground, grabs him, throws him in. Off they go, and they make it back to the first deck they can find, and they land with 10 minutes of fuel left in the tank. And the Rio had actually broken his leg, broken one leg and sprained his ankle on the other when he hit the ground after ejection. He outran the perfectly healthy pilot across that clearing to get to the helicopter. So he wanted to get out of there. But he, after the helicopter lands, engine shuts down, And the Rio limps up to Lassen and says, Lieutenant, I can't thank you enough for coming to get us. And Lassen had a very dry sense of humor. And he told him, he said, it's all right. We've been out here a number of months now. We were looking for something to do. And so he received,
thank you.
Right. So he received the Medal of Honor for that. But one of the most incredible events we've ever had at the museum, I had just started working here. It was 1993 in June. And we reunited the helicopter crew and the 2 guys they rescued on the anniversary of the mission, 25 years to the day. And not all 6 of them had been together since that night. Mm-hmm. So they told, for 2 hours, they just told stories and stories. And we were talking earlier about Medal of Honor recipients and how humble they were. Lassen was, he would interject with his sense of humor, very matter of fact. And he was sitting there with his medal, with that medal around his neck. And at the end, he stood up and he called the museum director up to the stage, and we didn't know what he was going to do. And he said, look, when they told me you're going to receive the Medal of Honor, I didn't even know what it was. And he said, quite honestly, it spends most of its time in its box in the back of my closet. And so I'm going to give it to you as long as you want it. And he took it off. And what made it a real poignant moment is he was dying of cancer. He had 10 months to live. Nobody really knew that. And he died. And as one of his squadron mates later told me, he was so humble that he did not want to be buried in a dress uniform or have any fanfare. So he's laid to rest at Branca Cemetery on board NAS Pensacola here in his overalls and flannel shirt he used to go fishing in. So very, very humble hero.
Wow. Yeah, we were talking about it earlier about the statement and the signal that this represents. And it's, most of the time they're posthumously awarded.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so to be in a room with that many people that have these around their neck, they're still breathing, drawing oxygen, is a kind of a moment of silence that A, you're in that presence of those those beings, and B, you kind of have a picture, a very rare picture, and a very incorrect picture because we did not live the life that they went through to get this. And so it's, anytime I see this, I had the opportunity to be next to Senior Chief Byers, and to hear him tell the story is just kind of mind-blowing about how that went down and how he was awarded that. But, and I asked him, I said, I bet you look at this medal and you think, A, I don't deserve it. B, somebody else should have gotten this award. But it's kind of a reminder of what I went through to get this, so it kind of combats itself. Because deep inside, they're all humble. None of them want it anyways, but they know that they're like, hey, this is for my brothers and my sisters of the war that I went through. Man, that's a powerful, powerful artifact.
Very much so. It is. And Lassen had a unique story. I mean, he inspires in so many ways. He started off in the enlisted ranks. He worked at Whiting Field on the flight line. And then he saw an opportunity to go to Pensacola Junior College, now Pensacola State College, and get his degree to join the cadet program. And he went through flight school and managed to make his way and work his way up to retiring as a commander. But he was very humble about that medal. And one of his squadron mates told me that he didn't even really like to wear it. And one of his squadron mates, it was a ceremony that was going on, and Lassen did not have his medal on. And he said, I know you don't like to wear it, but the people who you command, it honors them when you do wear it.
Yeah.
They want to see you wear it because it
powerful.
really, so it's so it's and that makes it that shows the impact.
Wow.
And then we have a few more things that we like to show. These two relate to prisoners of war. Those are the ribbons that belong to Rear Admiral Jeremiah Denton. And during a very highly decorated officer, he was shot down in 1965. And the Navy Cross is the highest decoration on there. And he received that in part because in the POW camps in North Vietnam, they were always trying to use the POWs for propaganda, to have them say that, yes, I bombed civilian targets, we're war criminals, this war is unjust. And they put Jeremiah Denton in front of a camera, a film crew, I think it was a Japanese film crew, and started the camera rolling. And what he did in front of the camera, instead of overtly resisting, What he did is he just sort of started to move his head around in a real sort of crazy way, and he's blinking his eyes over and over and over again. And they just thought he was embarrassing him, actually, and he paid for it a lot through torture. But what he was doing, blinking his eyes, he was blinking the word torture over and over again in Morse code, so intelligence officials would know that, hey, the North Vietnamese are saying they're treating us well, they're not. And so that's a tremendous lesson in putting, knowing he was going to suffer for that. He nevertheless wanted to make that statement. So that's one of the lessons we teach with those particular ribbons. And this drinking cup belonged to another POW. His name's Jack Ench. He is still alive. Lives out in San Diego and then spends time in Jacksonville. His call sign is Fingers, and I'll get to that why here in a moment. But Jack Ench lived really the highs and lows of naval aviation. He was a naval flight officer, so he was in the back seat of an F-4 Phantom when he and his pilot, Lieutenant Commander Muggs McEwen, shot down 2 MiGs on one flight during the Vietnam War in May of 1972. So to splash 2 MiGs in one mission, very rare occurrence. So then Muggs McEwen's ordered back to the United States. He's due for rotation, and he becomes the officer in charge of Top Gun, which had just been established a few years before. And Jack Ench stayed in theater, and he got another pilot. And so in August of 1972, he lived the low, in which they were hit by enemy fire. And so he was in the back seat of his Phantom, and he had his left hand on a handhold. And all of a sudden, the next thing he knows, it's a boom. And he sort of is knocked senseless for a few moments. And when he comes to, his left hand is in his lap. He's got blood all over him. There's shrapnel and plexiglass from the canopy that's embedded in his chest. And so he has the sense to lean forward and say, get over the water, get over the water. But he can see around the front seat that the pilot is just slumped over. And so the pilot was mortally wounded. So Jack, with one hand, initiates an ejection. Out he goes, and I think the airspeed was approximately 500 knots when he went out. So it dislocates both of his elbows. The ejection seat works as advertised, and next thing he knows, he's on the ground. And the way he described it is there was really, when he hit the ground, there was one show of mercy for him. And that was, there was a young girl that came out and saw his badly mangled left hand and wrapped it up. But after that, there was no mercy or no sympathy for him whatsoever. Very brutally treated. His family didn't know what had happened to him because with his elbows being dislocated, he couldn't reach his survival radio. So he couldn't trigger any message that he was alive. So it took about 4 months before his family knew whether he was dead or alive.
Wow.
So they took him into captivity. The way they would do it in the prisons of North Vietnam, they would keep you isolated initially from the other prisoners just to try to break your spirit, to not allow you to lean on the resources of that communication network they had established. So they'd sit him in front of a chair, try to interrogate him, make him sign statements, and he just kept trying to outwit the North Vietnamese. Like they asked who his commanding officer was. And he would think of an actual officer who had been a commanding officer of his, but had been promoted that he knew there was no chance of them ever being captured. And so he managed to evade things that way. But he would say it was very surprising. They'd say, what carrier are you from? And he'd say a carrier name, and they would actually say, no, that carrier left a month ago. And so he's like, well, why are you interrogating me then if you already know the information?
You already know that.
But for 3 days, he sat there. And if he didn't answer, they'd knock him off the stool, and he'd sit in that room. And then by this time, his arms are black and blue, blood circulation. So they finally take him for medical care. So they take him to what passes for a hospital. And the first thing they do is the doctor comes in and he said, I remember them telling me that you've inflicted pain on the Vietnamese people, and now we're going to inflict pain on you.
Wow.
So there's no anesthetic, no nothing. So they amputated his left thumb, and then they laid him on his back, put a foot in his chest, and they yanked out his elbows and popped him back into place. And he spent the rest of the war, August of 72 to March of 73, as a prisoner of war. And then he was repatriated, went on to serve, stayed on active duty. That's why he got the call sign Fingers, because he only had 9 of them, and ended up flying Tomcats and retiring as a captain. And
Wow.
so very incredible man. He and his wife Kathy are still alive, and they still make presentations to active duty officers for the Air Boss. He'll have a conference, I think, of squadron COs, and they come in and tell their story. Jack's from his perspective in captivity, and Kathy's what she was going through on the home front. So they're very a great people.
Unbelievable story. How, when you tell this story to the students,
They're
do you see a connection, or does it kind of go right over
well,
their head?
they're absolutely, they can't believe what he went through, the pain it must have been like, and the sense of, I'm in the hands of the enemy. I mean, I have no control over what's going to happen to me now.
The gloves
And,
are off.
they go from the most sophisticated environment, sophisticated weaponry, and now they're in literally a very primitive environment, which is what North Vietnam was back then. And the final thing we have, this came relatively recently, belonged to retired Vice Admiral Mark Fox, who retired as Deputy CENTCOM, I believe. A great gentleman. And he was one of the 2 naval aviators that shot down a MiG-21 on the first day of Operation Desert Storm, flying an F-18 Hornet with the Sunliners of VFA-81. And so he brought a bunch of his things, and one of them is the flight schedule for that night. And it has it's a poignant flight schedule because it's interesting because Fox signed it, and Nick Mongillo is one of the officers on there too, and that's the guy he shot down the MiG with. But also the name on there, Scott Spiker, has a resonance because he was the Scott Spiker, the first naval aviator shot down over Iraq during Operation Desert Storm. Eventually, a very convoluted story and history. Declared initially they thought he was maybe survived the crash. He was missing, presumed captured for a time, and then ultimately they found his remains. And but Fox and Spiker were department heads together, and Scott Spiker was not initially scheduled to fly that night, but he pleaded with Mark Fox to put him on the schedule. And so Admiral Fox was the one that went to the CO and said, Spike wants to fly tonight, and that ended up being his last mission ever. So that flight schedule is interesting. Also the helmet bag, and what we point out to the flight students is it still has, even though Lieutenant Commander Fox, it still has his ensign name tag. So that's likely the flight bag he carried, first one he was issued and carried around through flight school. And so that's another link to him. But I always conclude the tour with him as I've interviewed Admiral Fox over the years, and we talked about training and combat. And he would always say that, a lot of people think that when you go into combat, you think all of a sudden you're going to become just better because you're in a combat environment. But he said you will perform to the level to which you have trained, plain and simple. That's going to be your foundation. That's going to be your bedrock. All the adrenaline that's coming at you, that is what you're going to fall back on. So make everything you do in training count. Make sure that is, every flight, every briefing you go through is better than the one before. And then I'd like to conclude with him, because every one of these stories, he didn't know he was going to be shot down that day. He didn't know he was going to have to go rescue 4 people. Mary and Carl had no idea what he was going to face on Guadalcanal, but they trained to a point that they were going to be ready no matter what happened. So that's generally how we conclude the tour with the students.
I had a buddy of mine I went through flight school with. He, at the end of his RAG tour, he was a Pri-A student, so he went directly to deployment, directly to the fleet, and pointy nose. Out he went, right? He wrote a letter back to the RAG saying, hey guys, just a heads up, I was literally in the RAG 6 months ago, and I just went on a combat mission and ended up employing 6 months after leaving the RAG. And so that story had been played quite a bit at the RAG to remind students of saying, hey, look, these aren't just the heroes. Like, this can happen right when you go out to the fleet and your time comes. It doesn't matter what you fly, whether it's helicopters, whether it's pointy nose, whether it's cargo, whether it's multi-engine, it doesn't matter. If you're at the right place at the right time, you never know what you may be asked to do. And it's a beautiful display to get to be able to have the students coming through flight school to be like, hey, look, put your fingers on it. Look at it. It's real. It's real.
These are real people. They're not just in the history books.
They're not just in the history books.
They're real people.
And you never know, maybe your artifacts may be out here for something that you may be asked to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this is an absolute pleasure to get to be here, to get to see these things. Thank you, Hill.
Oh, happy to have you.
Man, it's awesome to get to spend time with you again and to actually see these up close and personal. I know our viewers will definitely love it as well. So thank you so much.
Oh, enjoyed it very much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
So hopefully by now you see the tremendous benefits in being an E3 Aviation Association member. Come join our community. We made it 10 times easier by incorporating it right here inside YouTube. When you click that join button right here below and become a YouTube member, you're automatically going to be added into the E3 Aviation platform and full-blown community. And we've even made a 100% guarantee. If at any time you're not blown away or you don't see the tremendous savings that you'll get as being an E3 member, just click the button inside your platform and we'll cancel it at any time. Now you've got absolutely nothing to lose. Come join our community, come have fun. I hope to see you in some of our events and we'll see you inside the platform. Take care.